Spoiler alert, no, I don't think it really matters. We are back. You are chatting with John P. Today we are going to be talking about certifications of chronometers, COSC, and whether or not I think it really matters in the year 2020. Spoiler alert, no, I don't think it really matters, but I will explain my reasoning and start from the beginning. But of course, thank you so much for coming back for another episode. I really do appreciate it. Please do not forget to thumbs up, like, and subscribe. I know I mentioned it at the beginning of every video, but YouTube is getting a little bit crazy with their algorithms. Everyone's talking about it, so I really do appreciate it. And of course, you can find chronometers and many other watches at delraywatch.com, where we're still having a little bit of a holiday discount, if you will, so check that out as well. So chronometers. What are chronometers? Where did they come from? This is important. You know, sometimes if you're just getting into watch collecting, you might see chronometers, COSC certifications. You go on the Rolex forums, WatchUseek, and just kind of drive yourself crazy with these timekeeping standards that people kind of like to create a lot of fuss about. People like to argue, dispute, go back and forth about timekeeping, which watches keep better time. Here's the thing, guys. There's different timekeeping standards out there, but in the grand scheme of things, what really matters is the keeping of time. Now, if we look at chronometers and watches back through history, they were really created to be precise instruments for utility, navigators, or just the general person that needed to know what time it is. When they were first invented, of course, they were a little bit more geared towards royalty, nobility, explorers, things of that nature, but over the course of time, they became more adopted and more universally accepted and more produced, of course, by hand, considering machining just wasn't a thing. But nonetheless, they had to be incredibly accurate because explorers and people's lives depended on them. Also, you didn't have a smartphone. Now, you pull up a smartphone and you just know what time it is. There's clocks everywhere that run on quartz or are controlled by radio signals. So timekeeping today is not an issue, but it was throughout history. And so when manufacturers, or really watchmakers and artisans at that point, would create watches, they would have a third party kind of test them, make sure that they were keeping standard. And that's where we get the COSC certification standard from, -4 +6, because it's always better to be early than late, if you know what I mean. So when you consider the -4 +6, and plus, in addition to that, there's many other different types of tests that watch movement is put through. For example, different temperatures, different positions, so on and so forth. The watches are actually observed for a handful of days to make sure that they are keeping good time and everything is okay. Apparently, there's some cameras involved in the process. A lot of the process is still not available to the general public's open eyes, but apparently this is a very big thing still to this day. But keep in mind that only 3% of the Swiss watch industry has chronometer COSC certifications yearly, so it's still a fairly small chunk of Swiss watches are being certified chronometers. And we also need to consider that when a watch is a certified chronometer, the movement is being tested, right, in a laboratory with a very specific guidelines and set of tests. Now, when you recase that movement, ship it off, send it around the world, sits on a shelf, goes through different temperatures, moving ups and downs, dropped off a forklift somewhere in a warehouse, eventually makes it to your wrist. Sure, is it probably still going to keep chronometer specs? Yeah, probably. I'm sure the boxes are insulated, this and that. But is it really? Probably, but is it going to keep the same timekeeping that it was in the lab? No, absolutely not. There's so many additional variables that cannot be accounted for. Now, what it does mean is that originally the watch was keeping chronometer spec. It passed everything. It was keeping -4 +6 along with all the other things. So that's nice to know, right? It proves that that movement is certainly capable of doing so under the right adjustments by a fully certified, trained professional watchmaker. Now, that's nice to know, right? It shows that nothing specific about that watch is going to be necessarily not functioning, but more so it shows that the movement that's being used at scale is capable of keeping great time. And it's by a third party, right? It's by COSC. So, it can't just be Rolex saying, hey, our watches keep the best time. There's a different party actually creating and certifying that watch. And I'll touch on that later. So remind me later in the video to talk about that. But we have to consider watches and the way they're designed and how they float around in the public. Now, when you consider that watches are being traded, handled between multiple people, and also if you just buy a watch and it needs to get serviced in, let's say, 5 years, well, if you send a watch into Breitling, they're not going to recertify the watch as a chronometer for you unless you specify. You give it to your local watchmaker, they're not going to certify it. But I don't think that it even matters that you recertify that watch, because just because you have that certification doesn't mean that the watch is not keeping bad time. I've seen so many watches come from Rolex that are still keeping COSC timing, but for example, you get a Porsche design watch, a $1,000, $2,000 watch, you put it on the time grapher, and in multiple positions, it's keeping 0 seconds per day, which is amazing with a high amplitude, and it was outperforming Rolex. And so, sure, at scale, are they probably a little bit better? Yes, of course, but there's no guarantees. And once it leaves that factory, gets recased, put back in after the observing, after the testing, there's really no saying what's going to happen. And when you send that watch back in to Breitling, Rolex, or some of the others, you have to go out of your way to ask for that piece of paper. Now, let's say you have an Omega and you want that COSC certification. It doesn't come with the watch. There's no proof of it actually being COSC certified when you get the watch. You have to reach out to customer service. You have to have the warranty card fully dated and signed in your name, by the way. If you don't have that, forget about it. If you buy a watch from Joma Shop, you're not going to get it because you don't have the warranty card. And then you have to pay them $100 for the proof that your watch was keeping good time to begin with. Otherwise, you just have to take the customer service rep that's located who knows where in the world. You just have to take their word for it that your watch was a chronometer because, hey, we do chronometers and we're this company and we do COSC certification on all of our watches. So you really just have to trust them. And when considering watches are no longer utility, more luxury, very few people are looking at this stuff like the watch geeks, watch collectors like us, the guys on the forums. It just really makes me wonder, is it really worth it? Financially, I don't know, right? I don't know what it costs them to get a watch certified, right? Rolex is cutting big checks. Breitling is cutting big checks. Are they testing every watch, or maybe do they just slip you a paper if someone asks questions later and different lots and batches of watches? Now, COSC certification, they have 3 laboratories, but if you consider that a little over 1 million watches per year are getting certified, that roughly means that 6,000 watches have to be observed and worked on by any laboratory at any given day, which I think is really large to be put through that stringent testing. Now, considering that they do go over the watch and observe it for a few days. So there needs to be 6,000 watches on the floor being observed by COSC at each location every day. I think that's a lot to manage. It's a lot to handle. It's a lot to put through all the stringent tests. You can see all the certifications, all the specs on the internet. You can see other videos more in depth about that certification process. I'm not COSC. I think it's a little wild, and considering that any skilled watchmaker or master watchmaker can finally tune a watch to get it to keep better, if not the same COSC spec, and that might cost you $175. It costs you a little bit more than having that certification, but you also can save a lot on the back end by buying pre-owned and not having to go into the Omega boutique and pay retail price because they don't bargain. So a little bit of food for thought, guys. What do you think about the certification testing? Oh, and by the way, Grand Seiko, which is one of the brands that is praised on the forum for having some of the best timekeeping and consistency standards, they came out with their own methodology, right, of testing, which is better than COSC because, hey, they're not even eligible because they're not in Switzerland, so there's no way they're going to do it. So it just goes to show that COSC isn't everything. It's nice, it's glitzy, it looks cool, and it's a nice kind of buzzword that people like to throw around, right? Tourbillon, COSC, escapement, balance wheel, hairspring. Oh, we're watch collectors. You know what I mean? But leave in the comments below what you think about COSC, certifications, what it means to you, as well as do you think it really matters anymore when movements are all pretty good, even from entry-level watches up to the top. Movements are pretty solid today. I know this for sure. What do you think? comments below. And by the way, I don't discredit COSC in any way. I just think it doesn't make a whole big difference in the year 2020. Thanks for watching, guys. You have been chatting with John P. Ciao.